Let's start with what do we mean by economic crime using their definition. And so we're looking at large scale really here, fraud against the individual, terrorist financing, sanctions contravention, market abuse, corruption, and obviously therefore bribery, and also the laundering of proceeds of all crimes. Potentially, I think the UK is well placed, but more needs to be done. A lot of the correct structure is actually already in place. I don't think we need much more legislation, though I've got one particular proposal I'll develop a little later. In my experience, the level of interagency cooperation is high, and in particular with overseas agencies, especially US and DOJ. But in addition to sufficient funding, what is really needed is the necessary drive to actually make it work at all levels. Of course, we've got to have intelligence gathering and sharing and disruption, making it difficult for criminals. We then need effective prosecution in a much shorter timescale than we have at present, and much greater civil asset recovery. Now, what I'm going to say about it is not meant to be unduly negative. It is full of good intentions and framework initiatives. And there is reference there to the private sector and how everybody has to work together. Well, that's great, but much more is needed about practical delivery. What I want to see develop is my headline, get the money back. Now that can come about in two ways. At the end of a criminal prosecution, obviously you can have confiscation proceedings, but that may be years down the line, and the assets may simply not be there. What can be done, I think effectively, is much more around civil asset recovery, and that's something I want to see develop too in public-private partnership. Much greater use of POCA, Proceeds of Crime Act, Part 5. It's a really effective but still greatly underused remedy, and that's where I want to see some of the focus coming in. So I want to see the great words in the policy paper turn into action. NECC is a really good idea and it's already doing great work, but it needs to go further. But what it mustn't become is just a top-level talking shop, where at the end everyone has what pre-COVID might have been a virtual group hug, said, yeah, it's really bad, we must all do something about it. But again, nothing happens, and everyone goes away and says, well, at least we talked about it. Now, NECC already does more than that, but what I want to focus on is what more can be done. There is already the talk about public-private initiative around intelligence sharing. Well, that's great, but once you've got the intelligence, you've got to do something with it. And that's where you need effective investigation and civil asset recovery. But what you do need is expert asset tracing. And too often, government agencies just don't have it. It's not the lack of will, it is there, the lack of resources. And although people come to work for the public sector for good motives, some will not do it because of the money involved, or those agencies may just not have the money available. I could put together a team of experts right now. But, of course, they will have to be paid. And that may mean that some of the recovery pot has to be shared. Potentially, morally, that could be very unattractive. Say, well, why should these people be profiting in this way? But I'm going to pose the question another way, both for the victims of crime and companies, and indeed countries where their assets have been stripped. Might it not be better to get 80% back than nothing? And I think that's a real question now that we have to ask. Something that's been written up a lot as being part of the Brave New World is the Economic Crime Court, which is described beautifully in many publications, the Salisbury Square development. It'll last 125 years, and it's going to create lots of jobs and have civil courts and criminal courts and brand new technology. That's great. We'd all like somewhere better to work. A lot of the court structure, frankly, needs a bit more than a facelift. But what is it actually going to do? Because although it's talked about putting everything into one building, there's nothing in any of the proposals about actually changing the way we do things at the moment. What we need in this area is a much tighter attitude in relation to focusing on core issues in major trials, very active, enhanced, I'm going to call it, enhanced case management and specialist training for judges in this area. Yes, use the technology. Yes, good to have the facilities, but you've got to have good procedure to match it. Otherwise, it is simply cosmetic and looks pretty on a brochure. I want to see specialist training for judges so that they can use the smart new facilities in the proposed economic crime court. I want to see enhanced case management, focusing cases on core issues, and much more proportionate disclosure, which slows down so many trials. I also want to see reform of corporate liability law. In particular, I want to see it come into law that there is the offence of failure to prevent economic crime. It can't always be a mopping up exercise by the agencies. You've got to have the protections in place to start with. All this requires drive and tone from the top. There is much more a return to the belief in the rule of law, that it actually matters. And that then is a tone which permeates worldwide. And that has to drive absolutely everything that we do. Overall, I want to see a pragmatic approach. Enough talking about it, let's do it. And so here in the end are my big three. 1, public-private partnership on asset recovery. Use the private sector and get the money back. 2, reform of corporate liability. Include failure to prevent economic crime. 3, enhanced case management. Train the judges and get the job done.